Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us again. You've reached another of our weekly installments of the Virsec Security Lab's weekly vulnerability analysis. Joined, as always, by Satya Gupta, our founder and CTO. And Satya is going to be stepping us through the top 5 vulnerabilities that his team has analyzed this week and give us an overview of the severity, the impact, and some of the details of what the risks are. So thanks again, Satya.
Thank you, Billy.
And Satya, why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of an overview, and then we can talk to these top 5 vulnerabilities and drill into it.
Absolutely. So let me start by sharing off my screen here. And so what we are going to be talking about today is 2 long-standing vulnerabilities. One that affects the Windows TCP/IP stack and how it really mishandles IPv6 packets. And then another one about also about Windows, how the graphical interface has a remote code execution vulnerability in it. The third vulnerability that I picked is about Apache Solar, which is really an app that is used very extensively by elastic searches and load balancing purposes. And then the fourth vulnerability that I picked up is about PcVue, which is a very popular SCADA software that's used in the building management, in applications. And then finally, a fifth one that relates to PulseSecure. Although it says desktop here, it affects PulseSecure's policy manager, which is really a VPN box that is very extensively used. In this particular week, Billy, we've had, the first one that I picked was the CV 2020-16-898. This is also known as a bad neighbor vulnerability. And it basically relates to how the Windows TCP/IP stack handles ICMP packets, essentially. And so this vulnerability has been around, is kind of present in all distributions of Windows 10, and they date back to July 29, 2015, and several versions of the Windows Server software, which the earliest version goes back to March 20, 2018. And so as you can see, the vulnerability has sort of been in the Windows stack for in the client stack for 5.5 years, and in the server stack for 2.5 years. And it's remarkable that this vulnerability has a very high CVSS score, 8.8, which means it has a very high severity and a very high risk associated with it. And the interesting part is that this risk is accentuated by the fact that there is a publicly available exploit available that Microsoft has released to its into its protection program, and so that makes it a little bit easier to write an exploit which will which people can use to exploit this particular software, this particular piece of software.
And remote code execution vulnerabilities are particularly frightening, aren't they? Along with this being seems like such a fundamental part of the Microsoft infrastructure.
Exactly. What it means is, your server can be exploited by somebody on the other side of the server, and it makes it particularly dangerous because, servers, unlike desktop clients, are available or exposed to the internet 24/7. And without any user intervention in in a personal endpoint, you'd have to have some action being taken by a user, a victim. But in the case of a server, a vulnerable application out there is very exploitable, highly exploitable. So because the age of this vulnerability, as we discussed earlier, was about 5.5 years for client OSs and 2.5 years for server OS, that means and the fact that there is a publicly available exploit available makes it really super easy for even less talented attackers to be able to exploit it. But fortunately, the Virsec security platform has capabilities to be able to protect the end users from being attacked, essentially. So we have this SKU that we call VSP host, as which basically prevents malicious software from running on a server on a server. So that's the good news out there.
So Virsec would stop this vulnerability from being exploited.
Yes, very much so.
Okay, great. And obviously, if this one had a 5-year dwell time, You know, that seems like one of the key things to stop vulnerabilities you haven't heard about with huge dwell times from being exploited.
And yes, absolutely. And there's a, every server will have some OS, and there's a very strong presence of Windows in the data center market out there. So, so I would say a very large majority of systems would be exposed by this vulnerability.
Okay, great. So let's move along here.
So the second one that I've picked is got a CV number of 2020-16911, and it relates to the Windows graphical device interface, how GDI handles objects in memory. And as you can see here, a very large number of releases of Windows Server and Windows desktops, client OSs are affected by it. So as I traced back the history, I found that the client version, meaning Windows RT 8.1, was which was released in August 2013, and the server OS, which was released in September 2012. This is how long this vulnerabilities existed. So it's over 7 or 8 years in the case of server OSs. So this is really a nasty attack. Again, it has a very high CVSS score. But fortunately, the good news is that there's no exploit is not publicly available. But that does not mean sophisticated attackers cannot really construct that exploit, and it is very likely that it's getting exploited at this point. And I would say that the good news again here is that with the Virsec security platform, we have this VSP host capability that would absolutely block anything other than whitelisted processes from running. So the good news is that we can actually protect our users from such an attack.
And both of these seem like they're core functions of Windows, which aren't really optional, your graphics display or your TCP/IP stack.
That's exactly right, Billy. So it's really, far-reaching in its implications and all. And, because of the age, as we noted here, there's a very high degree of risk associated with these two. And that's the reason why I picked these for this week.
And now I see Apache seems to come up every week. So
very much so. Yeah, very much so. This Apache Solar is an open source enterprise search platform, and it's built on top of Apache Lucene, which includes capabilities for full text search and faceted search, real-time searches, and all that is used very frequently by many enterprise applications. And so again, this the version of Apache Solar that was affected was 6.6.0, and it went way back into June 2017. So we've had an exposure window of over 3 years on this one as well. And the bad news here is that it is publicly disclosed exploits are available, and I'm very sure that this has been getting exploited very heavily at this point in time. But again, once again, the good news is that we have in the Virsec security platform, we have the VSP host. Two of our capabilities, the whitelisting capability and the file system management capability, would absolutely detect the abuse of this particular vulnerability, and we'd actually be able to protect applications that are using this particular software very well without really having to send patches and all into, or take patches and start in a very disruptive manner.
Sure. And I know patching is never always easier said than done, and always.
It's exactly right.
People want to avoid emergency patches, even though it seems like you should be patching every day.
Exactly, and as we've been speaking about this, Billy, and patching, there's some statistics to indicate 30+% of patches are defective in the first get-go. So you might end up having to patch again and again, and this is what causes a problem in the SCADA systems. And that brings me to my fourth vulnerability of the week, which is an application that's very extensively used in building management software, and it is a vulnerability that has existed since 2007, believe it or not. And so this exposure window of this particular vulnerability is 13 years, and that it has a very, very high score. It's like at the very top of the layer, 10 would be the absolute maximum. So it's scored a 9.8, and it's in the critical variety. And in this particular case, fortunately, no public domain exploits are available yet, but it's only a matter of time. But again, the good news is that with the Virsec security platform, we would absolutely be able to protect the customers' installations out there.
Okay, yeah, and that's probably indicative of the ICS and SCADA world where software and hardware is around for 20, 30 years. And
Exactly.
More difficult to patch. So covering these legacy apps seems particularly important.
Absolutely. And the age of this particular attack, of this vulnerability is 13 years. Yeah, imagine that. It's been around for 13 years, and I'm sure somebody out there some sophisticated attacker, given the critical nature of these SCADA systems, would be getting attacked for sure.
Sure, absolutely.
And so this brings me to my last vulnerability that I've picked. And one of the reasons why I picked this vulnerability is that it affects a VPN server, some software that's running in the VPN gateway. So VPNs are typically devices that help to isolate, prevents the bad guys from being able to get further deeper into the server infrastructure. So on the left side, you have these regular users. On the right side, you have application servers that are hosted on the web. And in the middle, we see this particular box that is isolating, random users from being able to go and access these resources on the right-hand side. So the goal of this VPN gateway, it's almost like a firewall and a IPS essentially, would actually block bad users from being able to connect to resources. And you kind of do that to sort of prevent malicious actors from walking over your software resources. And so this particular vulnerability affects 3 products from the Pulse family: Pulse Connect Secure, Pulse Policy Secure, Pulse Secure Desktop Client. And so there's a core version 9.1 that has remote code execution vulnerability in it. And this can be very easily be exploited. And with a very specific input, very craftily created input, you can cause a directory traversal vulnerability into the attack, into the VPN, and can access a whole bunch of data that would be priceless. That will allow users to be able to gain specific information from servers downstream from that particular VPN.
So it's another example of a security tool that's got a vulnerability, which is probably even worse than a typical server, because if you're tricking the security guard, then no one's watching the store. That's
right, exactly. And in the security space, we call it the confused deputy problem.
Mm-hmm.
If the deputy itself is confused, how can they actually protect anybody else, pretty much?
Right.
And the good news is that it's been around only for 6 months as compared to the 13 years in the previous instance. Fortunately, there's recourse out here by patching your software again. So what we have, the CVSS score is very high, 8.8, and whoever actually found this vulnerability is not forthcoming with their names and all. So that's a really interesting aspect out there. This kind of indicative of somebody being able to misuse, or I shouldn't say misuse, but being able to exploit, and they don't want to get into the public view essentially. So they don't want to take credit for exposing this vulnerability. Fortunately, VSP Web's solution, are the Virsec security platform web and host capabilities would actually be able to protect this Pulse Connect VPN gateways essentially. We'd be able to protect software that runs inside this box or upstream from it. We have the Virsec APG that would protect this. And so this would be something that customers can actually use to protect their so that is my list for this week here, Willie.
All right, thank you, Satya. Well, one last quick question. All of these have a very high CVSS base score, close to 9, which sounds very severe. I know we've discussed, and your team is also looking at additional factors because it seems like that's one indicator. But what are the other things people should look at and factor in as well as the base score?
Yes, absolutely. So there's other nuances which from next week onwards we'll actually be putting up a risk factor. So there's a difference between risk and severity. What you see here is a severity score, and what we will be assigning it is a risk score, which is basically if you kind of break the vulnerability down, the details of the vulnerability, if it comes in from over the network, it will have it'll present a higher risk compared to something that is requires physical access or privileged access into the application that is being targeted. What that means is that anybody who's on the other side of the application can actually attack this, as opposed to somebody who has privileges to walk into or has physical access onto the server where the attack is going to get conducted. So like that, we've kind of broken it down into 7 or 8 different factors out there that we will be speaking of, and we will be creating not just the severity score but a risk score that talks about how long is the exposure window, what is the preponderance of these servers in a typical Fortune 100 company's infrastructure. And so we actually have a much more detailed analysis that will indicate how to weigh the risk that you're carrying essentially in your own networks.
All right, well, we'll look forward to that next week, and that does sound important because I know you said, 500 new vulnerabilities this week, so, prioritizing these, I think, seems important, and I think any ways that, we and others can help to do that seems important. Well, thank you again, Satya. Always a lot to think about here, and as always, this report is published weekly, as well as these videos, so look at our Bright Talk channel, you can see our weekly videos. And we will continue this next week. Also, please see our weekly, typically on Thursday, webinars on a wide range of security and thought leadership topics. So thanks again, Satya, and thanks to the audience as always.
Thank you, Willie.